there a continuation of that tapestry that was woven between your two parents?
You know, and if you look at American history and what was happening in the 60s and 70s, a very tumultuous period, and I don't think the history has not been finalized yet. There's still more to be written about it. But, you know, at the end of the 60s and the early 70s, in the Jewish world, there were those who admired my father and many who did not. And in fact, that my father went to Selma to march, nobody talked about it. It took about 10 years after his death before people would say to me, I'm so glad that he was there, I'm proud of him. It wasn't at the time, he was lonely. And you know, there were other Jewish leaders like Meir Kahane, who started the Jewish Defense League, who said, never again to the Jews. My father said, never again to anybody. And
And for your father, or for the legacy within, I mean, do you find that there is still connection between the Jewish community and the Black community?
I mean, obviously there is, by us being here today, probably not as strong as it was. We don't have the same type of leaders as we had during that time. They were very strong voices during their time. And so I think the kinship is there, but we have to do a better job of cultivating it. You know, in our community, you know, it's, especially with the new generation coming along and a lot of the rights that are still yet to be attained, there's a lot of frustration and a lot of anger, and I think a lot of young people are wrestling with, you know, how to embrace a Dr. King versus embracing some of those in their mind and the way they perceived, like a Malcolm X or those from the Black Power movement. And so because of that, I think it creates somewhat of a strain and a tension. But I think we have a responsibility to help them understand the connections, the nexus, and the strength. And so, you know, I think we have a lot of work to do in that regard. But again, I think it's, you know, the history of oppression for both is where the connection is made. And we have to just continue to keep that alive in each generation, I believe.
Keep having that conversation.
Yes, exactly, exactly, because we lose it.
I think it's very important for people in the Jewish community in America to realize just how deeply ingrained racism is in this country and how it manifests itself, how in sometimes subtle ways and sometimes in overt ways, directly through murder. I hope that everybody's read Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. There are many more books that need to be written along the line of that study. But I think that Charlottesville and what happened there may have been a wake-up call for a lot of Jews. It certainly gave me the feeling that maybe, in fact, I won't be able to live in this country forever, or my children, or my grandchildren. I don't know, but it unsettled me terribly, and it made me, in a very visceral way, think about what it's like to be Black in this country. When a policeman stops my car, I don't fear for my life. That's a big issue, a big difference, and I think it's very important for us to think what it's like to be a United States citizen, stopped by the law, and be in danger of one's life by someone who represents the state. That's a terrible thing, what's going on in this country. We're just perhaps beginning to pay attention. This is not new. But think how deep that is. At the turn of the century, the Jewish immigrants from Russia were appalled. They fled Russia because of pogroms. And they came to this country and they saw lynchings and they said, look at this, how can this be? Pogroms in America. They're not directed against Jews, they're directed against black people. How can this be America with pogroms? This is not America, this is not what it's supposed to be. And they had screaming headlines in the Yiddish press about this. And I would like to see some screaming headlines in the Jewish newspapers today as well. And of course,
Jody, let's see the video. This is a 2-minute video focusing on Dr. Heschel, actually.
They come from such totally different backgrounds. My father from a Hasidic family in Warsaw, and Martin Luther King from a Baptist background in the American South. It's a very odd combination, and it's one of the American miracles. They had similar theological sensibilities. My father discovered a Christian who was making the Hebrew Bible the center of the American discussion. Amazing. And he was very moved by that. And the fact that my father wrote the book on the prophets also was very important. Andrew Young told me that everybody had a copy of that book on the prophets and carried around in their pocket.
And of course I know I did, and I've kept it on my desk ever since. Yeah, it's one of the books when I move, I know where that book is.
I have always seen him as a kind of intellectual father. And whenever I get a little down or depressed, I go get one of his books and I read the prophet Isaiah and what he has to say about Isaiah. Because Isaiah was written at a time of the desolation of Israel. And yet it's the loftiest vision of dreams for humankind. It's people's ability to have faith in the midst of persecution and destruction that black Americans tapped into. And if you notice Martin Luther King's speeches, he quotes from the prophets more than almost anybody else. And he got a lot of those insights from his study of Rabbi Heschel.
King was impacted by Heschel's analysis of the prophets. Heschel made the conviction of the prophet that God is here in our immediate struggle, and that God's struggle is a struggle to help those who are voiceless to find voice, those who are blind to find sight, that it's in that unique dimension that God is most present.
I know that at the time, a lot of people saw both of your fathers as somewhat polarizing, at least controversial figures. You know, and listening to that and how important the writings of Dr. Heschel were, or Rabbi Heschel were to your father, and what your father was doing for Rabbi Heschel. Do you think that God is here? I mean, did that, what we were hearing, does that happen? Has that happened? I would think there would be a lot of people who think no.
That God is not present with us.
He's making us wait an awfully long time.
Well, I think we have to understand that we are co-creators with God. That God, does his work through human vessels. One of the things that my father said is that one of the tragedies of human history is that the children of darkness are often more zealous and determined than the children of light.
yes.
And so we who are the children of light have to be a little bit more determined and zealous. And we have to embody the Spirit of God in this time. And unfortunately, we are not as zealous. We allow too much darkness, and people who prefer to advance darkness to be predominant in our culture. But I believe he's present with us. The fact that we are breathing, the fact that we still have an opportunity to protest, the fact that we still have a voice, the fact that, we are making some changes in this society, the fact that, just perfect example for me, there's a gentleman by the name of Daryl Davis, He's a blues singer. He lives in the state of Maryland. And he decided that he was going to connect with members of the Klan. And based off of how do you hate me when you don't know me? And he did just that. He went into their world seeking to understand them. And certainly God had to be present because 25 of them denounced the Klan, turned their robe over to him, and now there is no really formal Klan organization in the state of Maryland because he befriended those that were high in leadership. And so that doesn't just happen. That kind of hate and hostility that's deep in people's being, there's the presence, to me, of God working in and through a Darryl.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes.
And I would say, you know, as tough as this conversation is now around gun control and what do we do about guns in our society, you know, I think from 2012 with those kids after Trayvon Martin up until what we've seen with Parkland, you know, I have seen God's presence. I think God is speaking to us and continues to speak to us through these young people.
Yes.
I want to turn the conversation to the two of you a little bit and ask how all of this history, all of this legacy has influenced who you've become and who you want to be in the world. I mean, you've talked a little bit, Susanna, about you became a religious scholar because of Bernice's father. What else?
Are you speaking to
Both of you. Both of you.
You know, one of the things that I think about so much these days in particular was the way in which your father spoke to people, even when people were being unfriendly, rude, aggressive. He was always a person of great dignity who chose his words carefully and spoke with respect, even of people who were antagonistic. And I think that's a very important lesson. It's especially on my mind these days, I think, because of all the vulgarity that we're hearing in Washington and throughout the country, how important that is. And also that is, in some sense, a religious lesson, because language is the tool of God. God creates the world through language. So we have to watch our tongue. And yes, I appreciate that. So I feel inspired also. I'll tell you a story. Okay, yes, of course, I became a scholar of religion because Dr. King made me fall in love with the Bible. And that's true, and with the prophets in particular. But there was another lesson I'll mention to you. He also taught me something about, what should I say?